works. All right. Thanks for waiting. I'm going to wait on my slides, too, I guess. So we're going to talk about what's so dang hard about building with Bitcoin and building Bitcoin applications. Another good talk might be what's so dang hard about getting slides on the screen. Sorry, no disrespect to the people in the back. I'm sure they're working real hard on it. Anyways, yeah, so I work at Chain.com, and Chain.com is a blockchain services company for developers. And so we spend all of our time thinking about how we can take the Bitcoin protocol and all of its great energy and all of its promise, and how we can build abstractions and build services so that developers can come to Bitcoin and just hit the ground running and start working on ideas. So, this past couple of weeks have been kind of rough for Bitcoin. Let's see if I can work this. The price has been doing one of these things, and a lot of people have been touting during this time of turmoil in the Bitcoin price that don't worry, because the technology is what's interesting, and the price will figure itself out, and we can just be confident that if we keep pushing the ball forward and we keep innovating, through things like derivatives and just like the market stabilization, the price will work itself out. So what is this technology that people are talking about, and what are we actually doing to kind of bring that technology to the masses? Bitcoin is still very much a niche technology. Even in San Francisco, a very tech-savvy scene, not everybody is down on, knows about Bitcoin. So there's still a lot of work that we can do to kind of bring Bitcoin both in terms of the currency, but also in terms of the application, to a broad range of people. So what does it really mean? Like, when we talk about like blockchain as this technology that's going to enable all types of applications, what does that really mean? What does it mean to build apps on top of Bitcoin? And so I kind of put together a really kind of loose definition of the way that I think about it. And one kind of aspect is that we put data into the blockchain. So when I build like an iPhone app or I build a web application, I'm going to have a database, I'm going to write users, and I'm going to store tweets, or I'm going to store timelines and all this stuff that's important to my application. But with a Bitcoin app, we also have this other database, which is the blockchain, and so we'll store data in there as well. Another way to think about it is, building an application on top of Bitcoin is programmatically controlling the currency. And I think this is really exciting. And again, there's some tension with the whole currency thing, but nevertheless, this is a great opportunity, because to date, like, I haven't been able to build all sorts of cool apps on top of my bank. Charles Schwab doesn't have an iPhone SDK, and I don't think that they're ever going to have one. But this is our time for developers and tinkerers, because now we have the system that, in its start, like, it started off as a tool for developers. And so we have these APIs kind of built into the system from day one. And then the third note here is kind of anecdotal, but one of the great things about building on top of the Bitcoin platform is that we don't need to sign for an account. There's no gatekeepers holding us back. We can dive right in. So what are some examples of Bitcoin apps? And these are certainly ones that you've probably already heard of. Circle Wallet, like, that's a Bitcoin application. BitPesa, moving money, remittance, and we've all heard great remittance stories, but moving money from London to Kenya, that's a Bitcoin application. ChangeTip is one of my favorites, like sending people beers over Twitter. Like, that's a lot of fun. That's a Bitcoin application. The last one on this list I think is actually really interesting, and it's more of like the data in the blockchain and not necessarily the programmatic access to currency. But what proof of existence does is it's a website, and you can Google this and use it right now. But you can take a document, you can produce a hash of that document. So let's say that I wrote a poem, and I put this poem in a PDF, and I hashed it, and then I went to proof of existence, and I submitted them my PDF. They would take the hash of that document, they would create a Bitcoin transaction with that hash in there, and they would publish it into the blockchain. And so now the world forever knows that I wrote this poem, and I have proved that it exists. And so this is like, a step in the right direction of like an application that just wasn't possible before Bitcoin, and it doesn't necessarily relate to currency. So these are the types of applications that get me really excited about, what's next in terms of building with Bitcoin. So as like an application developer, let's say that I'm really good at building iPhone apps, and I know how to build like a web app, and I know about Node.js, and I know about Swift and all these technologies. Like, but then I'm coming into Bitcoin, and I'm like, okay, I've got like I'm going to gloss over this detail, but I think it's the hardest part. I've got an idea for a Bitcoin application, and now I'm ready to like start building. So what am I going to do? So there's a couple of challenges that I'm going to face when I get going. And the first is, and I'm speaking from personal experience here. Like when I first got into like building applications of Bitcoin, like my first hurdle was the data model, because historically, like we don't have a lot of like this is a new technology, like fundamentally. So there's not a lot of like common knowledge, or there's not a lot of like previous experiences that I can draw upon when it comes to designing an application that runs on the blockchain. And we're going to hash through some of these, but this is kind of the high level. Also, the stakes are really high. I mean, again, not so much these days, but if I lost a lot of Bitcoin, that could represent some real dollar. And so I have to be very careful with the security of my application and the way that I design like my key management systems and so forth. And then the third point is kind of a note about just the current landscape of developer experience, but there's not like, and we're seeing good tools being put into the marketplace. Like this past year has been great for Bitcoin developers. There's a lot of great open source libraries. Bitcoin Core is moving forward. There's a lot of good services and websites available to developers. But still, we're in the very early ages here. And so if I was just an iPhone developer, like I would go into the ecospace and there would just be tons of tools. Like there would be a library for everything that I wanted to do. If I wanted to interact with a camera, or I wanted to do like facial recognition, or I wanted to do NFC. Like there's tons of great libraries and services out there for me as an iPhone developer to do those things. But when I come to Bitcoin, like those things aren't there. Like the market is really underdeveloped. But that's okay, because over time, like we're going to get there. But today, that's still a problem. So back to the data model. One of the things that like is kind of shocking to most developers is when you come to Bitcoin, you think, okay, like I'm going to create a transaction, and then I'm going to like continue doing the work that my program needs to do. But this is not the case. So typically, like if I'm writing, like let's say I'm building Twitter, and somebody creates a new tweet, and I want to write that to a database, it takes me like 10 milliseconds to do that operation. And then once that's written, like I can be confident, like I can move on in my program, and I can do other things. But with the blockchain, there's this whole confirmation thing, there's this whole block thing, and like it takes 10 minutes, and like even then we're not really sure that it worked. Like we have to maybe wait 60 minutes, and I have to like think about all of these things as I'm designing my application. So that's a really tricky point. The other thing that's kind of weird is that the whole data model for Bitcoin, it's very elegant and it's very simple, but that doesn't mean that it's easy. And so as a new developer, when you're coming into this space, there's a lot of knowledge that you just kind of have to know from the get-go. For instance, like transactions are nested and they depend on each other. And so in this example here, now this is a pretty, like, there's a lot of data on the screen, so don't feel like you have to read it all. I'll kind of give you the high level. But like we have transaction 0 over here that has inputs and outputs, and transaction 1 and transaction 2 depend upon transaction 0. And so we kind of build this tree of like dependencies of transactions. And so again, like if I'm a developer and I'm coming to Bitcoin, like I kind of have to know how all of this works, and it takes a lot of time to kind of get that knowledge bootstrapped, at least for me, anyways. So once I kind of understand, like, okay, this is how blocks and confirmations work, and then I get a grasp of how transactions work, then I'm like, okay, great. Now, so what do I do? How do I go about like understanding like how to write my application? Like how do I talk to the blockchain? Like how do I dial in and actually get the data? So I download the Bitcoin Core software, like the official project, and out of the box, it kind of gives me 2 ways to access the data. It gives me the ability to find a transaction by ID, and it gives me the ability to find a block. And so these aren't necessarily like the greatest things. Like this doesn't inspire me to go out and build the next killer iPhone app. Like there's a lot of work between like these low-level APIs and like what I need to do to create like a beautiful user experience. And so really kind of, what I would like to have and what I ended up needing a lot when I first was developing applications was I needed a way to say, okay, I have like a Bitcoin address, and I want to see all the transactions that this address has ever been involved with. Or the second point, which is interesting, is I want to find all the transactions that are available for me to spend. Because if you recall when I showed that slide of the transaction dependencies, to create a new transaction, you have to find a previous transaction to include as an input. And so you have to have this ability to take an address and say, okay, give me all of the potential transactions that I can spend before I create a new transaction. And so, the standard software and the standard toolkits out there don't they help you out a little bit, but they still leave a lot of work left to happen on the table. It's not really easy. It's simple, but it's not necessarily easy. And so those are kind of like the issues that we see with the data model. And then we also have to now think about the kind of the security model of keys and key management. So, quick refresher, like in Bitcoin, we have a private key, and from that private key, we derive a public key, and from that public key, we derive an address. And the address is the thing that we kind of paste around and we share over the internet. But what's important to me as an application developer, if I'm going to give if I'm going to create some new Bitcoin experience, I'm going to put it on an iPhone, I have to give that phone somehow the ability to create a transaction, which means that they need the private key. And so what do I do with that private key? Like, do I put it on the phone? And what happens if they lose the phone? What happens if they're out on the beach on a warm, beautiful day and they're not here in a conference and they accidentally lose their phone into the water? What happens? Is all their money gone? Do they lose their history? Is their account forever gone? So there's a lot of things that, as an application developer, I have to think about when it comes to the security of the key. And then, another point, and we've kind of heard this a couple of times today, but not all keys are created equal. How do I even create a random key? Do I trust the libraries that are out there? Basically, we take the we all kind of take for granted that when we generate a key, it's unique and that no other person has ever generated that same private key. But how do we really know that? And as an application developer, how much time should I spend thinking about how those keys are generated? It's definitely something that you kind of have to keep in your mind when you go to build the application. And so, one of the things that has been great over this last year, I would say, in Bitcoin development is kind of the growing popularity of multi-signature. And so instead of having just one key, on one phone, where if somebody loses their phone, that their Bitcoin is forever gone, we can create a system where we have many keys. For example, we could have 3 total keys for each user, and to create a new transaction, there has to be 2 of the keys present. And so maybe one key is stored on the iPhone, and another key is stored on my application server, and then the iPhone and the application server have to connect together to be able to create a new transaction. And the third key is maybe stored in some backup location, either by the application developer or by the user. So there are ways that we can improve the situation a lot for people who are going to be users of our Bitcoin applications. But there's even perils there that we have to consider. For instance, when we generate the 3 keys that are needed to form a new multi-signature address, are we sure that the 2 keys have never been on the same system at the same time? Because if they have, then is it possible that there was malware or there was some weird logging issue that published both of those keys to that system? And then, did we generate the keys in a browser? Are we absolutely positive that we didn't have any Chrome extensions installed when we generated the keys? And what happens if our front-end app server, the thing that talks to our iPhone, what happens if that's compromised? What do we do in that scenario? How do we move money around? So these are all lots of problems that, as an application developer, if I want to come and build a Bitcoin application, I have to think about all of these things. And this is in addition to actually figuring out what my product's going to do. So I haven't even gotten to solve the problem at hand. I haven't even gotten started on talking about what my user experience is going to be like and how I'm going to get customers. This is all just how do I get started with Bitcoin? And so one of the things that I'm going to contend here, one of the things I'm going to argue, is that more abstractions and more services that help developers just do the right thing. If we can have those types of products in the marketplace, then what's going to happen is application developers like myself are going to be able to come to this space, and we're going to be able to kind of skip. If people make the right security decisions, and we build the right products that enforce those security decisions, and we have the right data layers in place, then I can kind of skip all of that work, and I can just go straight to focusing on building something for my users, actually building my product. And I don't think that like I'm too far out on a limb when I say this, because we actually, like, this is like the history of computing. And here are like a few examples of this. So Netflix, they're famous for not having any data centers. They use AWS for all of their operations. And the reason why they do this is because they say this publicly all the time. It's like they recognize themselves as being a streaming company. And so all of their engineering efforts, like all of their product efforts, they want to be focusing on how to get videos onto screens. And the data center is just kind of like a necessary evil. It's like, yeah, they need to have it, but like up to a certain point, if it's good, like if it's reliable, if it's fast, then anything will do. And so if we don't have to focus on building data centers and we can just use AWS, then we can take all that time and we can spend it on our product, and we can actually be solving user problems. Lyft is another great example. They didn't have to like come up with like, okay, like we have to figure out how to like get people around the city. We have to figure out how to work with drivers, and we have to build an iPhone app. And then we also have to build a payment system. Like, no, they didn't need to build a payment system. They could just use Stripe, and they could get back to focusing on what they're good at, and that is getting people from A to B. And then my favorite story here, probably because I worked at Heroku for 4 years, but one of my favorite stories is Urban Dictionary. So Urban Dictionary, everybody's used Urban Dictionary, right? Like, we all have those weird words that we hear, and we find out what they mean on Urban Dictionary, and we're shocked most of the time. But Urban Dictionary is a huge site, and only one person runs Urban Dictionary. His name's Aaron, and he's been running Urban Dictionary for like 8 or 9 years, and he deploys on top of Heroku, and that gives him a lot of freedom. Like, he doesn't have to waste his time doing all of these like weird stuff with servers and application upgrades. Like, he can just spend all of his time like picking the word of the day, and and I don't know what else he does, but he has a really good time. But this service layer and these abstractions kind of allowed him to just focus on the product and just focus on building what he cared about, not necessarily all the things underneath it. So if we can agree that, like, yes, we need abstraction, we need services, so that way application developers can be ushering in like the new age of the Bitcoin application, what does that look like? What are these services and what are these abstractions going to do? And so basically, and there's so much work on these 3 points, but it's these 3 points, I believe. So easy, verifiable data access. So we talked about like how do we get transaction history, and how do we get unspent transactions, and how do we like navigate the blockchain and provide like really quick but reliable access to that data. We have to have that in place. But I also say verifiable, because we don't want to lose the spirit of Bitcoin and its decentralized nature. There's no reason that we have to trade convenience for verifiability. So one of the things that I think that we're going to see in the next year is these APIs that produce like these aggregated data sets that are easy to get. Like, I can just make one API call, and then like 20 milliseconds later I can get like the transaction history for an address, or the unspent outputs for an address. I think that those APIs can also produce cryptographic proofs, so that if consumers of those APIs want to verify that the data that they're getting back is correct, they could potentially run some sort of light Bitcoin node that uses some sort of header verification. Or there's even notions of cryptographically signing unspent outputs. So I think that there's a lot of options that we're going to see that are going to bring easy, verifiable data access to developers who want to be building on Bitcoin. Secure key management. This is something that is we're definitely still in the early ages of, because every few months we hear of some sort of key compromise, and we're getting the industry is getting much better at it. I think we're doing a great job, and we're going to keep pushing that forward, and we're going to keep making it easier for application developers, for exchanges, et cetera, to be able to build a Bitcoin application, and they can be certain that because they're building on top of their abstractions, that they're not going to be subject to these single points of failure or any other sort of esoteric key problem. But the third point here, which I think is probably most important, and that is developer experience. Because again, what we need is we need millions of people building Bitcoin apps. We need millions of developers. We need mainstream developers building applications on top of Bitcoin, so that we can really get the benefits of this technology that we're talking about. And so what does that mean? What is required to have a good developer experience? They're pretty simple, but again, there's a lot of work and there's a lot of design choices that need to be made here. But basically, documentation. We have to have great documentation. If you want to build a blog, let's just say that you wanted to build a blog on the internet, and you Google that. You said, how do I build a blog on the internet? Google probably has a terabyte worth of links that will show you exactly how to build a blog on the internet. And if you wanted to build a Bitcoin application, you might get 100 links. And so what we need is we need to see more developer resources that say, okay, assuming that you know how to use Node.js, here's how to do this really cool thing with Bitcoin. And we just need we need resource after resource after resource, teaching developers how we can build Bitcoin applications. We need language integration. So we have to have Swift language integration for iOS. We always have to be on the latest and greatest because new developers are going to be flocking to these new technologies, and it's important that Bitcoin be really well represented in those spaces so that people just can naturally start building applications on top of Bitcoin. And again, this is more the third and fourth points here really relate to service providers. So, for example, Amazon and Stripe and Heroku are really good at these things, and these are really important for application developers who are building on top of Bitcoin service providers, and that is fast-acting customer service. So again, if the goal here is that we want to create these amazing consumer experiences on top of Bitcoin, then the application developers are going to have to do a really good job of making sure that the system doesn't go down and that their apps are always online and that they always work. And so if those application developers are supposed to be doing that, then and they're building on top of Bitcoin services, then these Bitcoin services also need to have really good customer support, because at the bottom layer, we have to make sure that the entire stack is running smoothly. Otherwise, the consumers are not going to have a good experience, and Bitcoin might be perceived as not working that well. So, and robust operations go hand in hand. Building stuff that is really fast and doesn't fail. All of these are kind of necessary to build the next generation, the amazing Bitcoin applications that we're going to be seeing in the next few years. And so, of course, what do these look like? I have a few examples that I've taken from Chain.com, and so this is kind of where it gets a little bit salesy, but bear with me. If you go to Chain.com, you can kind of see an example of the ways that we're starting to think about how we can provide developer experiences that kind of meet these notions of what good developer experience is. So language integration, for example, and just having very clean documentation on how this stuff works. Also providing really good web experiences so that developers who are building and debugging their applications can figure out exactly what messages are being sent and if they were successful or not. And then also just building tools that are designed for developers so that developers can cut through a lot of the chase when they're debugging how their transactions are being propagated across the network. So, in kind of summary, the hardest thing really, the hardest thing about building with Bitcoin is really understanding how we're going to transform the consumer experience. The technology, while there's certainly hurdles, and we've looked at a few here today, we're going to overcome them. There are going to be tons of great open source libraries. We're going to get way better at documentation. We're going to have all these great developer experiences. But the hardest part, and this is kind of the challenge to everybody here, is how can we take this technology that is so great that we're willing to put up with all sorts of weird price fluctuations? We're okay with that because what we believe is that the technology is really great. How can we take that and how can we build applications that were just not possible before Bitcoin? Understanding how to do that is the hardest thing. But I know we're going to get there too. So thank you very much for your time. I'll be around, and maybe we can brainstorm some ideas. But thanks again.